Mitch Ebenez, COO of Vessel, and Adam Boxkey, who's the mobile canning manager, and they'll be talking today about cans and seaming. So please welcome Mitch.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. It's always fun to see what's happening in the industry and have everyone together and celebrate craft beer. We also have Evan Singer, our technical sales guy, who's here to answer any questions at the end as well. So I just have a brief kind of rundown on outlining seaming and canning equipment. Hopefully you find some... Hard to hear? Okay. Is that better? Okay, I'll try and talk directly into this thing. Just to kind of go over where the market is going, with the market now progressing further and further, and breweries becoming more and more established. They're looking to purchase their own canning lines, and just kind of giving some background information on potentially what to look for when purchasing equipment, and then also just how to monitor the seaming situation. So to get into this, more and more can and end styles are hitting the market, trying to match the product with the brand. There's more to can styles than just the 473s and 355 ml beer cans these days. Sleeks and slims. It's all starting to hit the market now and having more interest. So it's very important to know how you want to approach your brand, what can styles there are, what can styles are available, and then what adjustments needed to be made to the equipment to accommodate such adjustments. For the equipment side, there's more and more manufacturers these days that are producing smaller speed, slower run canning equipment. It is very important to make sure when you're sourcing equipment to put an onus on the technical support from the manufacturer and the service they provide. Also the training that they have available. More and more, you always see when equipment goes down, regardless of what equipment that is. So it's very important when you make that phone call that someone is there to answer the call and answer your questions, and give you some guidance on what approach to take when you're having issues. So let's talk seams. Obviously, it's just a picture of a cross section of a seam, the double seam that is on all beverage cans. Just kind of gives you an outline of what we're looking at for some measurements and what the internal image of the seam is itself. We're going to get into some measurement tools. This is a micrometer. Obviously, if you have a canning line and it shows up with the canning line, it is the main tool to check all your specifications and make sure your seams are all in check. The biggest thing with these micrometers is they do come out of calibration. So you're now looking at measurements that aren't necessarily accurate, and you're making adjustments, and you still seeing the same problem. So with these, it's always the best case to ensure that you have a backup, or another piece is to have gauge blocks. So these gauge blocks are a specific measurement to check and clarify that your micrometer is reading correctly, but also to have multiple gauge blocks, just to have verification on different sizes when you are measuring it at different widths. So these are these gauge blocks. There's a few manufacturers that have them, that sell them. They aren't cheap based off of their precision that are needed. So it's always good to have a couple different sizes. We have the two different sizes that we were given with our seam equipment, our inspection equipment. So we found it very crucial to double check, obviously, all our micrometers that are going out on our mobile lines, and then double checking again with our seam inspection equipment. So this is it. The next tool that's very critical that doesn't regularly come with the canning line is a countersink gauge. The countersink gauge is very important in checking that the chuck and roller heights on your canning lines are at the right height. This is kind of the base level that you would start at if you're seeing a seaming issue. So it is very important that this is a mandatory check of your seams when the issues are occurring. We've come across the issue, you know, on our own line or on having our customers that we're sending cans to having unable to measure the countersink, and it's just something that kind of gets missed on regular routine checks. So this method is these tools are obviously just a side cutters and file. This is for breaking down your seams manually. It is a finicky process in a sense that now you're adding human error to the process, which isn't the perfect one. But we found that this one is and has the capabilities of being the best type of method. There are other methods out there that have a can opener type style, but when we were measuring the seams, it was pinching the seams in, not giving us accurate readings. So there are different methods. Different manufacturers will tell you different ways of doing it. This is one that we just found most beneficial on our end. So we'll get into some seam measurements. Again, the countersink depth, that is how far the lid is kind of sitting inside the can. It is very, very important to keep track of the countersink, to see the movement in the rollers to chuck. That's when you can start seeing a lot of problems, when all of a sudden the chuck is now, or the rollers have loosened off and they're starting to hit the chuck and you're not really noticing that. The countersink measurement is the one that'll tell you when that comes out of spec. Seam height, so that's kind of looking straight on the can and looking at the seam height there. This will tell you an indication of almost how much metal is being placed into it. So on the higher end of the spec, you're getting a little bit more coverage. Lower end of the spec, you're not getting as much seam coverage. Seam thickness. This will also tell you how much is actually inside of the seam. So where the body hook and cover hook overlap, adding the 5 pieces of metal that are in the seam, you're measuring that thickness. If it's too high, you're adding, you know, more air that the seam will then start to leak as it's too loose over time when it's pressurized, and then too tight could cause more damage to it, fracturing the seam, more internal problems. The body hook is the flange of the can that sticks out when you have your blank can. That gets folded over, and that creates your body hook. It overlaps with the cover hook, so the cover hook is kind of squeezed in between the body hook and the body of the can. So those two provide the overlap for the seam, which manually you're unable to measure. There is a formula for determining the overlap, but as we see further down in this presentation, that there is equipment out there that can provide the image and the measurements for the overlap. The pressure ridge. So the pressure ridge is on the inside lip. Once we do a manual teardown, you can see a line that goes all the way around the inside of the rim of the can. This is very important because this tells you how tight the seam is. So if the seam isn't tight, it'll be very vague. It won't be continuous all the way around. So you want to see a definitive pressure ridge, because now you know that the tightness of your seam is where you need it to be. So getting into the end and seam specs, this comes from the manufacturers of the lids. It's always based off of the lid and not of the body of the can. Some lids are interchangeable with the bodies of the cans, but it's always very important to get this from the can manufacturer or the can supplier, in our case, which outlines the setup range for when a tech is setting up the line. They want to keep it in a tighter range, and then there's also an operating range for these specifications, and then bullet points on if you're seeing any variation, and info off of that. So this spec sheet's for a super end. There's Aloise, there's different closing lids, there's 360 lids. All these lid varieties have different spec sheets, and they have variations in seam heights or thicknesses and such. So it's always very important to get these spec sheets, get up-to-date ones, continuing to try and get up-to-date ones. Just kind of holding that manufacturer responsible for providing an accurate spec sheet. So here is just based off of when measuring. Using the micrometer again is adding human error to the fact that you now have a tightening zone. Some people are very, very tight on them, some are very loose on them. So it's always beneficial to always have two people when starting out measuring, so not telling each other what you're getting, and seeing how close you are, so you're keeping that error as low as possible, and that everyone's kind of measuring in the same methods. Because time and time again, when you're doing measurements and you're trying to make adjustments, and people are getting different readings, and how you're getting different readings, and what's the proper method. So it's tightening to a point of first resistance on a micrometer, and that's as light as possible. Aluminum is, not the sturdiest in its flat form, so you can crush the seam, you can dent it. And it's important to make sure that you're getting the correct measurement, or else you just don't have a base point to work from. Also having, obviously, the spec sheet handy for reference, just when you're doing all these measurements, to make sure that it's in spec and in the right operating range. Recording these measurements is very important. You want to make sure that if your seams are moving over time, that you're recording this, and having a history of it, just to make sure that, if it's migrating a little bit, you can get ahead of the movement and make some minor adjustments, and not have, all of a sudden my seams are messed up and now I can't package for the day and I have to fulfill orders, and how am I gonna fix this? So it's always good to be proactive in these situations, and following the routine maintenance that is prescribed by the manufacturers, and also how you can take it to the next level. Being more specific on canning lines is obviously the best form, due to it being a machine, and it sooner or later is going to malfunction. So we'll get into a manual seam breakdown. This is what our crews do on a daily basis. Then they'll bring cans back to do our seam inspections. So again, it's still a human error type deal, and there's ways of doing it right, and there's obviously ways of doing it severely wrong to try and get the right measurements. So to start, you file around all the way around the edge until in the one picture you can kind of see a line that comes through the top of the seam. That means you've gone through the top portion of that seam, now going to get into the body hook. And you want to make sure that you're not putting too much pressure on it, or else that body hook measurement will get adjusted accordingly. That's kind of shown in the picture on the right. You want to, after you've pried the lid open, you get the nice line all the way around. You can pry it with the file. Then you want to stick your finger around the edge of the body hook to make sure that you're not filing into it, and if you have filed into it, not to measure that portion based off of it being now a faulty reading. Once you've filed off and you take the inside of the lid, this is what I was speaking to on the pressure ridge. You can see the line all the way around the inside of the can. It should be very visible, very clear, very smooth all the way around. You don't want to notice any dipping, dents, V's. The seam should seem like a nice, clean, visual thing. This is how you separate the cover hook from the body hook. Taking the cutters, cutting into it, and it's a finicky thing when you're trying to use a file and just to try and get the front edge of that cover hook off all the way around the can without damaging it. It's obviously quite tricky, but at the same point, with a manual breakdown, there's always room for error in those. Once you've removed it, what's left is the body hook on the picture on the far left side. In measuring that, you're measuring vertically. You want to make sure, again, that that's smooth all the way around on the top and the bottom. You don't want any dips and V's and things like that where errors can happen, where maybe the roller is out, maybe it's too loose, too tight. Then there's a cover hook on the right-hand side. So when you peel that little piece off, it's this tiny little part, and on the inside you're trying to measure it, and it's a terrible, tedious little thing to try and get your holding it right and measuring it. But when you do get it, and it just takes a lot of practice. The breakdown method takes a lot of practice. But once you kind of have the procedure for it, it is quite simple. The easiest way to check seams is to purchase one of these babies. This seam inspection equipment is costly, but at the same point, if you're canning every day, it pays for itself. There are, again, many providers of these seam inspection equipment. We've went with a CMC Kunke machine. What happens with it is it has, it can measure the thickness more accurately. It has the countersink. It has a cutter to cut into the sides of the seams. So we do 3 cuts on per can, and it visually shows you the inside of the seam, which I had a picture of earlier. And it's just another point of reference. So when you're doing manual measurements and manual breakdowns, you can actually confirm your measurements with such a piece of equipment. Or if you're having problems, you can have very, very accurate readings pretty quickly on these. This is a picture of what the seam inspection provides you. As you can see, the measurements of body hook, cover hook, seam height, and then you can obviously see the overlap. The overlap is dependent on the body hook and cover hook. So if one or the other is a little lower in spec, most likely the overlap is low. So you always want to make sure you're getting a solid body hook, a solid cover hook in the middle of the range. So you can really count on that overlap being there and being solid. Next point is troubleshooting. If any measurements are out of spec, obviously further assessment is definitely needed. Sometimes it's always like, oh, do I shut down? Do I not? The best practice is to shut down. Stop running the line, figure out why this is happening. Some manuals are good, some aren't. A resource we've found handy is doubleseam.com. It has a very, very in-depth website, pictures, explanations on how to fix it, what might be the issue, more information than you probably want to fill your mind with at that time. But it's always beneficial to try and gain that knowledge when you can and before the fact of starting to can. If you're interested in it and looking to get your own canning line or have your own canning line, just reading on the website, seeing what to look for, training the people based off of the information. The more information, the better, just so you can be proactive again on checking these things. Not a lot of fixes are simple. Can require multiple adjustments. Some are simple, but for the most part, there's always tweaking involved. It happens. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but that's kind of learning the equipment, learning seaming, learning the cans, learning every day. Just something's always happening on the canning lines that you're learning from. Again, I can't reiterate it enough. Before adjusting anything, always check your device that you're measuring with, making sure that it is in calibration. That's where it all starts, and then we can go forth. When you are seeing a problem, always going to the first operation only, and checking those specifications, because there are 2 operations in the seaming with the 2 rollers. First one comes in, and that's 80% of the seam itself is in the first operation. That creates the meat of the seam, and the second operation comes in and it just squeezes the tightness of the seam. So if there's any issues, revert back to your first operation, and start from there. If that is well in spec, then you can move to the second operation and see if there's any issues with that second op, and then you can continue down the path of trying to troubleshoot the issue. If you know what the cause, you potentially know what the cause is, but you're unsure how to make the adjustment, call your canning line manufacturer. Try and get them on the phone as quickly as possible, just to reiterate the steps that need to be taken in order to make those adjustments. Use the resources of doubleseam.com. The manuals on a lot of canning machines are very, very good, and they've come a long way in the last 5 years. So leaning on those as well. They're pretty straightforward on their descriptions of how to make some minor adjustments anyway. Then there's also the checklists. The checklists on what to look for on the daily, the monthly, weekly. Looking for damage on your chuck and rollers consistently before you start up. Having it on a checklist for your operators. Hey, did you check this? Yes, I did. Is there play in the chuck and rollers? So the chuck and rollers, the chuck is on a motor, which is inserted in and is on a bearing, right? So if that bearing is loose, that chuck is now loose, you'll get inconsistent seams. So now you have a bearing inside each roller. If those bearings become old and worn out, you're going to see and feel the play in that roller. That means those bearings needs to be changed out. You want nice, firm, freely spinning bearings. You can over-grease the rollers and you can under-grease the rollers. So when purchasing and maintaining canning lines, you want to get the accurate amount of grease going into these rollers, because you're causing damage on either end. So there is a particular way that you want to grease the rollers. Even in the swing arms and stuff, it's all bearing related. The cams, it's all bearing related. So all these bearings, again, can wear out over time, become loose, give you some issues. So it's just looking for those finer details as to why is this happening. Everything seems to be operating well other than this odd seam. Those are the types of things that you'll look for. Routine maintenance records. Again, the manufacturers provide some maintenance. You'll come up with other maintenance routines and checklists for it. They have, again, come a long way in what maintenance needs to be done on each line, how often. I would recommend doing it sooner than what they're recommending, and having daily checks, because you just never know with equipment what's going to happen on the day-to-day. And then having the right tools for the jobs to be able to troubleshoot. If you're unable to measure countersink, if you're unable to measure overlap and things like that, it's very difficult to pinpoint what the problem is. So the more you can have the proper tools to troubleshoot these issues, the downtime is going to be saved, and it'll pay for it the first time that you have an issue. So really having the backup parts, really having the right tools for this. The backup parts are crucial. You're going to run into faulty sensors. You're going to run into faulty cylinders and things like that. So having these backup parts, again, to save downtime makes a world of a difference, from 1 day to a week to 2 weeks to not knowing. So having these parts and having a manufacturer that has these parts readily available, and you can keep them on hand or you can get them overnighted, is the biggest thing. It's always trouble dealing with the borders, and most of the manufacturers are in the States or overseas. So trying to get those parts across the border in time for the next day or a couple days from now is always difficult, because it's always a question mark. So having those parts on hand really makes a big difference. That's all I had for a presentation. I hope some of the information is applicable, kind of raises some ideas and things like that. We are here to help. We're here to help for all questions relating to canning lines, our experiences with them. We have stuck with Wild Goose canning lines from day one, but the simplicity of canning and seaming is a very similar operation. There might be some specifics for each manufacturer, but overall it's a very similar process. So we always are here for any questions, and don't hesitate to ask for any support when this happens, from either using a mobile canning line and then getting your own line, or just diving into your own line to start. Always set up a meeting, a call, and we can kind of go through some experiences to make that transition as easy as possible. So, are there any questions for us? No? Nothing? Seaming or can related? No? Yep. Yep. They recommend doing it at an angle. What angle is kind of, it's up for assessment, I would say. I kind of keep it at like a 30 degree angle. And then when I'm getting close, I go more flat, because then it'll actually change the sound on you once you do hit that little portion. It'll sound like you're rubbing it on a free piece of aluminum. So, again, not trying to put as much pressure on it to get to the body hook. It will take 20, 30 cans to really get in a routine on how to do it. But yeah, it's kind of a 30 degree angle to flat at the last. Yeah. Yeah, so like you're gonna file it in a little bit of an angle to try and get, because there's a little gap between the top of the seam and that body hook. So you're just trying to get that gap, and the angle. They've recommended it at that angle, because on a lot of the lids, the seam actually sits at an angle going out. So you're just matching that, so it is a little bit at an angle. Yeah. Yep. 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 Yeah, because the cut and the tearing method we found we can never get it consistent. Some people have, obviously they're recommending it, so it's always kind of what method you feel like and your operators feel like they get the best results from in not damaging a seam. Because with manual, you're going to wreck some cans, you're going to have to take some other ones. So it's trying to find that process of which one is best suited and which one's most repeatable, for when the days that you're not running the canning line, or you have a sales call or something, that you can trust that method is coming back accurate. Yep. Great. Oh yeah, sorry.
With the Wild Goose, is there a particular lid that you would recommend over others?
It depends on which can size. Like at 473, 355 mil, Crown offers super ends and LOE lids. Ball offers a CDL, which is their version of the super end, and an LOE lid. The super end benefit that Crown wants to move away from the LOEs is it has less aluminum to it, so it uses less aluminum in having that little angle. Honestly, it's just kind of a preference and price thing. LOEs obviously having more aluminum, they charge a little bit more for them. Super ends don't. We've heard both sides of the story, but with Crown wanting to get away from LOEs eventually, they won't be fully able to, but for the most part, they're trying to go the super end route. Yeah.
Any sort of specialty ends from Crown are really only going to be available in super ends going forward. They're only doing like massive runs for specific customers on LOEs with colored tabs, colored shells, custom and sizing, so the engraving that says recyclable or otherwise. They'll do that mostly on super ends, but stock isn't typically carried on LOEs.
That's a good point to bring up, is that when shipping, the beer is now going further and further away from your facilities. When going into Quebec and stuff, it has to have a certain engraving on it, so the lid does have to be different, just for engraving purposes of of being in French and having the recyclable amount on it. So just kind of keeping that in mind if beer is going further and further east, to kind of have that idea if it's going to get into Quebec. Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate everyone coming by.